I want to share with you a story of a season of brokenness from my life so that you can start to think through examples of brokenness from your own story. Often with your care receivers, you'll share from your own experience to encourage them and to get them to think about how to live out the principles that they're learning. But before I tell you the story, I need to tell you a little background. Week before last, we learned about flesh. My flesh is very positive, performance-oriented, people-pleasing, accommodating, don't rock the boat kind of flesh. Not only was I a firstborn child, but I was also the firstborn grandchild on both sides of my family. To add to that, I was born in Germany while my father was stationed in the army there, and my family in the States didn't get to meet me until I was almost 2 years old. Well, let me tell you, I was a little darling. Everything I did was praised and celebrated, from my first steps to my first A to my first job. And I got really good at performing for approval and acceptance. And this developed flesh and behaviors that followed me into adulthood. So this is where my story picks up. People pleaser that I was always striving to meet others' expectations of me and follow what I called the plan. Well, the plan was to do your best in school, graduate, get a good job, and then get married. I graduated with honors, of course, from the University of Georgia with a bachelor's degree in business. When I graduated, I had been dating a boy from my hometown for almost a year, and we went to the same church. Our parents sang in the church choir together. I was good friends with his sister, and he was a Christian. It was a match made in heaven. So about a year after graduation, following the plan, we got married. I was 23 years old. We both loved serving in our church together. We led the youth group there. We believed that God was in the center of our marriage, and we had a bright outlook for the future. We didn't know about things like false beliefs and flesh back then. Well, his need for approval and my need to please created quite a dynamic in our marriage. This is usually the part of the story that I like to yada yada over, but that's not what we're here to do today. We're here to be honest and transparent. So I'll give you the short version. The short version of the story is at 27, I found myself on the receiving end of infidelity and in a courtroom listening to a judge dissolve my marriage. Well, that was not part of the plan, I can tell you that. It was a really dark and lonely time for me. You see, things had always worked out pretty well for me in my life. I was a hard worker, and when I worked hard at something, I generally got what I wanted. This was the first time in my life that I'd worked as hard as I could. I was the very best wife I knew how to be, and the outcome wasn't what I desired or expected. At 27, I wanted to be well on my way to driving the carpool to Little League, not single again with a big D on my resume. During this time, I had a lot of self-doubt. I had a lot of feelings of guilt and shame and condemnation. I was wondering where I'd gone wrong, thinking surely there was something I could have done to make things work. You would think that this is where I was broken. Sadly, no. I was brokenhearted. I was suffering greatly, but I was not truly in a position of brokenness. I was still striving. I was still trying hard to fix and make things work for myself. I was doing this so well that one day in the middle of the divorce process, I was called into my boss's office. You see, I hadn't told a single soul at work what I was going through. Well, I was completely convinced that day I was about to be fired. Not only was I losing my marriage, but I was about to lose my job too. I was certain my boss was going to fire me for slacking off at work, for disappearing for hours on end. On the worst days, I would just get in my car and I'd drive up 400 and I'd end up in Dahlonega and I'd sit on a bench in a park there and just cry. But instead of firing me, my boss praised my work and gave me a raise and a promotion. You see, I had not come to the end of myself. I was still operating out of self-effort. I was still operating out of my flesh. And y'all, I was exhausted. Oh, I was praying during this time. I was praying constantly. I was praying in my closet in the dark. I was praying things like, God, help me figure this out. Help me understand what I can do differently. Help me fix my broken heart, mend my broken marriage. I prayed for God to change my circumstances, not change me. Several of my deeply ingrained flesh behaviors and patterns were actively at work throughout this whole time. Performing for approval, check. Isolating, check. Denial, check. I told everybody I'm fine all the time. I was experiencing a lot of flesh emotions too: shame, depression, anxiety, just to name a few. After the divorce, we sold our home, and I was in a real desert place. I now had a label that went something like this: big fat failure. That is not a great label for someone with positive flesh, for sure. I isolated myself. I continued to pray. I continued to try to figure out what was next for me, all by myself. I didn't want to go back to our church where there was a lot of gossip and rumors, so I just bounced from church to church. I didn't tell a soul I was divorced. I wandered in that desert place for more than a year, dating someone I shouldn't have dated, still performing for approval like crazy, and growing further and further away from God. I was angry at God that things didn't work out the way I wanted, and I was so sold out to Him and doing my marriage His way. But I didn't tell Him I was angry. My story of true brokenness didn't begin until 2 long, lonely, very tiring years later. I was attending First Baptist Atlanta North, where Andy was pastor. I joined a small group. I was serving in the preschool department. I'm still close with some of those women from that very first small group today. One of them even became my sister-in-law when she married my brother, and they have my 3 amazing nephews. I had found my way back to God. Throughout this time, I prayed many, many, many times, Lord, I want what you want for me. And every single time, I would always add these little P.S. prayers in my head after that prayer. But surely what you want for me is marriage and a family, right? Or you don't want me to be a weird old maid Aunt Amy to my nieces and nephews, right, Lord? Or my favorite was, as long as that's not sending me into the mission field. I mean, every single time, I just couldn't help it. But one day, I was at work at my desk. I was reading my Bible. I was doing my homework for small group. And I remember this moment so vividly. I laid my head on my desk and I prayed, Lord, I give up. I'm tired. I'm tired of trying. I can't do this anymore. I want what you want for me, no matter what that is. The end. And then silence. No PSs. I really meant it this time. I wish I could say that life changed dramatically for me that day. It didn't. But I do know that peace flooded my soul like never before. I was hopeful and expectant for the future for the first time in a long time. It was almost like God was saying to me, well, all right, sugar, now we can get to work. Now I can show you what I have for you, which is beyond anything you could ask or imagine. This is what it looked like for me to get to the end of myself, to stop depending on self-effort and start depending on Christ. So that's my story. Do I still struggle with remaining in a posture of brokenness? Yes, weekly, sometimes daily, this morning. Some recent examples come to mind: not being able to solve my daughter's battle with anxiety and OCD, still figuring out how empty nest has changed the landscape of my daily life and my identity, caring for the changing needs of aging parents and in-laws, last week's family dinner party, just to name a few. So what about your story? As you think about your struggles, your trials, your suffering, have you experienced brokenness? Or have you been stubbornly clinging to your own way, your own plan, your rights, your flesh patterns? Has God brought you to the end of yourself where you want nothing more than you want Him? What has that looked like for you? What does that look like for you right now? Please share by answering the questions below.